Okay, so you've given us a ton to think about this time. This whole idea of ERM, enterprise risk management.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just some policy document gathering dust on a shelf. It's woven right into how an organization actually operates day to day.
Right, yeah.
And we're diving into how that ERM thinking shows up in 3 pretty different areas.
Mm-hmm.
Health and safety, managing projects, and then the whole world of the supply chain.
Yeah, for sure.
Drawing from that chapter you sent over.
Absolutely.
And our mission today is to pull out those key insights, those nuggets of wisdom, and really see how this systematic approach to risk plays out in these parts of a business that on the surface might seem totally separate, but are actually all interconnected.
Yeah, I think what's really cool here is seeing how that core approach to risk, first you spot it, then you figure out how bad it could be, and then you actually do something about it. That same logic pops up in all these different functions.
Right.
They might use different terms, maybe different tools even, but the underlying thinking is consistent.
Yeah, totally.
And I think you're going to have some aha moments along the way. Like why, when we talk about safety, a hazard isn't quite the same thing as a risk.
Right.
Or that constant juggling act in project management, that iron triangle they talk about.
Yeah.
Or how many companies actually have very limited visibility into the risks hiding way down in their supply chains. You'd be surprised.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's jump right into health and safety risk management.
Yeah.
So at its heart, this is a very focused area within ERM, and like the material highlights, it's all about getting rid of those hazards, the things that can actually cause harm to keep people safe. It's about being proactive, preventing bad things from happening.
Yeah, absolutely. And if we kind of zoom out to the big picture of ARM, health and safety risk management is very much about like defending against threats rather than, trying to seize opportunities. And what's key is that in a lot of places, this isn't just a nice to have, it's the law.
Right.
That UK Health and Safety at Work Act from 1974 that you pointed out. That's a great example. It lays out the must-dos for employers, and it all boils down to understanding and applying those basic risk management principles.
Yeah, and that act, it sets out some pretty non-negotiable things. First, you got to spot those potential hazards. Anything in the workplace that could cause injury or illness.
Yeah.
Then you have to assess the risk, which means figuring out how likely it is that someone's going to get hurt and how bad it could be if they do.
Right.
And finally, taking action. Either getting rid of the hazard entirely, or if that's just not possible, putting controls in place to manage those risks down to a level everyone agrees is okay.
And that distinction, right, between a hazard and a risk, that's super important.
Yeah.
It's fundamental. So a hazard, think of it as the potential for something bad to happen. Like, say you've got a chemical with a big warning label on it or some scaffolding that looks a little iffy.
Right.
The risk is what could actually go wrong. Someone gets burned by that chemical, or the scaffolding collapses and someone gets seriously hurt. And crucially, how likely that is to happen and how bad it would be. Yeah.
That's the risk part. So you can't treat every potential hazard with the same urgency.
Right.
You got to prioritize based on the actual risk.
That makes total sense.
Yeah.
So we're seeing that overall ERM cycle in play here. Identify, evaluate, treat, and monitor the risks. But health and safety has its own specific tools. It even uses its own language a bit. It's like following the same recipe, but the ingredients and the way you cook them are tailored for what you're making.
Yeah, that's a good analogy. And what's interesting here is how hazard identification really becomes a crucial part of understanding the context, that very first step in ERM.
Right.
And when it comes to evaluating those risks, health and safety, they often use those impact versus likelihood matrices, just like in broader ERM, plotting how bad something could be against how likely it is to happen. But they also bring in some specialized tools, like a bow tie diagram, which is basically a visual way to dig deep into a specific high-level risk.
Okay.
So on one side, you map out all the things that could cause that risk to happen.
Right. On the other side, you map out all the potential consequences if it does happen.
Okay.
And the knot of the bow tie is the risk itself. It's a great way to see the whole picture of a serious threat. Then there's root cause analysis to figure out the fundamental reasons why something went wrong.
Right.
And FMEA, failure mode and effects analysis, is a proactive technique to identify how things could go wrong before they do.
Okay. And when we're actually talking about controlling these risks, the material mentions a couple of really key ideas. The hierarchy of controls and the Swiss cheese model.
Right, yeah.
Could you break those down for us?
Absolutely. So the hierarchy of controls is like a fundamental principle in health and safety. It's basically a ranked list of actions with the most effective ways to control the risks at the very top. So first, you've got elimination. getting rid of the hazard completely.
Right.
If you can't do that, then you look at substitution, replacing something dangerous with something safer. Next comes engineering controls, which means making physical changes to the workplace to protect people, like machine guards or ventilation systems.
Right, yeah.
Then there are administrative controls, like work procedures, training programs, warning signs, all that stuff.
Okay.
And then at the very bottom, the least effective but sometimes necessary option is PPE, personal protective equipment.
Right.
Like your hard hats and goggles and all that. It's important to note, though, that this hierarchy is really designed for physical safety risks. It might not always be perfect for other kinds of risks in an organization.
Okay, so the focus is on tackling the risk at its source whenever possible.
Yeah.
And the Swiss cheese model. That sounds kind of interesting.
It's a great way to picture how accidents happen. Imagine like a stack of Swiss cheese slices, one behind the other.
Okay.
Each slice represents a layer of defense, something that's supposed to prevent an accident.
Right.
Now, each slice has holes in it.
Of course, yeah.
Those are like weaknesses or flaws in that defense. And an accident happens when just by chance all the holes line up.
Oh, I see.
And the hazard slips through all the defenses and actually causes an incident.
Right.
So the idea is you need multiple layers of control. Each layer might have its weaknesses, but with more layers, it's less likely they'll all fail at the same time.
Gotcha. That's a really good analogy.
Right.
It really highlights the importance of having backups, not relying on just one single thing.
Exactly.
Now, the material also talks about this idea of zero harm, which sounds amazing, especially in industries where the risks are already high.
Right.
But it also mentions the tension between that ideal and the reality that risk is just kind of a constant in a lot of work environments.
Yeah, and it's a really important point. So zero harm is a great aspiration. It can build a really strong safety culture.
Right.
But realistically, in a lot of workplaces, there's always going to be some level of risk.
Yeah.
You can't eliminate everything. There are practical limits and financial limits too.
Yeah, of course.
And that's where this concept of ALARP comes in, as low as reasonably practicable.
Okay.
Or sometimes you hear ALAR as low as reasonably achievable.
So LRUP, ALARP, ALARA, it's about finding that realistic balance.
Exactly. It's about setting a level of risk that, while it might not be zero, it's as low as you can reasonably make it, given what you know, the technology you have, the resources available, and the specifics of the work being done.
Okay.
It's a balancing act. You weigh the cost and effort of reducing the risk further against how much safer it would actually make things. And once you've got that ALARP or ALARA level, the organization has to put resources into maintaining those controls, whether it's getting rid of hazards or actively managing the risks that are left.
Right. So that gives us a good understanding of how those ERM principles play out in health and safety. Now let's shift gears to project risk management. Projects, as the material defines them, are those efforts that go beyond the day-to-day business as usual stuff to make a change or deliver something unique.
Yeah, that's right. The definition from the Project Management Institute sums it up pretty well. A project is a short-term undertaking with the goal of delivering a unique product, service, or result.
Right.
And what's interesting is, while different organizations might define projects a little differently, they tend to share some common characteristics.
Okay, like what?
So they're temporary, they have a start and end date, they're all about achieving a specific goal. They're often complex, and they're usually doing something new, something that hasn't been done before.
Right.
They also rely on people working together, often from different parts of the organization, and they're usually based on certain assumptions about the future, like we'll be able to get this resource, or this technology will be available when we need it.
Yeah, makes sense.
And all those characteristics are exactly why managing risk is so crucial for projects to succeed. The longer a project goes on and the more complex it gets, the more those assumptions come into play. And the more chances there are for something unexpected to happen that can throw the whole thing off course. That's why we've seen this, like evolution in project risk management since the 1990s. The goal is to protect the value that projects are supposed to deliver, and even enhance it if possible.
Now, when we're talking about whether a project's been successful, the material mentions that classic iron triangle, right?
Yeah.
Balancing time, cost, and scope.
Exactly. Making sure the project is finished on time, stays within budget, and delivers what it's supposed to.
Mm-hmm.
But There's often a third element that's just as important, and it's not always explicitly part of that triangle.
Okay, what's that?
It's often something like the performance, the quality, or the functionality of what the project is actually delivering. And the key thing to remember is that these three constraints, time, cost, and that scope or quality element, they're all connected. If you try to cut costs drastically, it's probably going to affect either the project timeline or the quality of what you end up with.
Right.
On the flip side, if you expand the scope of the project significantly, you're probably going to need more time and more money.
Yeah, it's a trade-off.
Exactly. So knowing which of those constraints is the most important for a particular project is key for assessing and managing those potential risks. For example, if there's a strict regulatory deadline, you might prioritize schedule above all else.
Right. And beyond just the iron triangle, there are other indicators of project success, too.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? Things like making sure the project is delivered with high quality and without any safety incidents, that it complies with all the rules and regulations, and in certain industries, that information is kept confidential.
Right, like in pharmaceuticals or defense.
Yeah.
And as a project goes along, the project manager is constantly checking progress against those key milestones. They're also revisiting those initial assumptions that the plan was built on.
Mm-hmm.
That ongoing monitoring allows for course correction and updates to those projections for timelines, budgets, and the likelihood of the project actually succeeding.
Gotcha. Now, the material also talks about programs and portfolios.
Yeah.
Could you explain the difference?
Sure. So a program is like a collection of related projects managed together to achieve a bigger strategic goal.
Okay.
Something that wouldn't be possible if each of those projects was managed separately.
Right. It's about that synergy.
Exactly. And what's great about program management is that it can create significant benefits for the organization.
Like what?
Well, by managing projects in a coordinated way, you can often do things more efficiently. You can leverage similar resources or approaches across different projects. You can make sure that all the individual project goals are aligned with the bigger picture.
Right.
And you can get a much more comprehensive view of the risks and rewards of the entire undertaking.
Makes sense.
And then there's portfolio management, which takes an even broader view.
Okay.
It's not about managing individual projects or even groups of projects. It's about choosing the right projects to start in the first place.
Gotcha.
It's about making sure that all the projects and organizations working on are actually aligned with its overall mission and its long-term goals.
Right, so it's about doing the right projects rather than just doing projects right.
Exactly. And this is where a lot of organizations can trip up.
Really?
It's surprisingly easy to end up with a bunch of projects that don't really contribute to the big picture, or to take on too much at once and stretch resources too thin. So effective portfolio management involves making tough decisions, prioritizing the projects that offer the most value, and having the discipline to say no to the ones that don't fit.
Yeah, that makes sense.
It's that link between the high-level strategy and the actual work that's being done.
Now, to manage all this project activity, especially in big, complex organizations, we often see a project management office, a PMO.
Yeah.
What role does the PMO play in all this risk management stuff?
So the PMO is kind of like a central hub for project management expertise.
Okay.
They develop and maintain standardized methods, tools, templates, best practice guidelines, that kind of thing. They might help with defining the scope of a project, developing realistic timelines, identifying dependencies between tasks, creating detailed budgets, and importantly, they support risk management by providing frameworks, processes, and sometimes even direct support to project teams to help them identify, assess, and address potential risks.
Gotcha.
Now, smaller organizations might not have a full-time PMO.
Right.
They might bring in external consultants as needed.
Okay, so just like with ERM in general, there are industry standards and best practices for project management too. Right?
Yeah, for sure. The material mentions some of the big ones like PMI in the US, APM in the UK, AIPM in Australia, and Prince 2, which is used across the UK, Europe, and Australia.
Okay.
And each of these bodies has its own guidance on project risk management. For example, PMI has their standard for risk management in portfolios, programs, and projects. APM offers the PRAM guide, which stands for Project Risk Analysis and Management Guide.
Okay.
And Prince 2 has a manual called Management of Risk, or MORE for short.
Right.
Now, while the specific words they use and the level of detail might differ a bit, the underlying principles are pretty consistent with the wider ERM framework. establishing the context, evaluating risks, addressing them, and then monitoring and reviewing.
Right.
The difference is in how those principles are applied to the specific characteristics of projects.
That's a really good overview of how ERM is embedded in project management.
Yeah.
Let's move on to our last topic for today, which is supply chain risk management. As the material explains, the supply chain is a fundamental part of an organization's value chain. It covers everything from getting raw materials to manufacturing products to getting those products or services to the end customer.
Yeah, it's the whole journey.
Exactly. And in today's world where everything's so interconnected, managing the supply chain has become even more crucial and probably more complex too.
Oh, definitely more complex.
Especially with so much outsourcing happening.
Right. Outsourcing can help with some risks, but it also brings in new ones.
Exactly, because now you're relying on other companies.
Yeah, you're relying on those third-party suppliers.
Right. And even further down the line, what they're calling nth-party risk.
Mm-hmm. It's a whole network of interconnected risks.
And those modern supply chains are up against a whole bunch of increasingly unpredictable risks, aren't they?
Oh, yeah. Tons of them.
The material breaks them down into some key categories. There's supplier risk, which includes things like data breaches at a supplier's facility or worries about their own ability to keep operating if something goes wrong.
Right.
Then there's transportation risk with things like customs delays, strikes that mess up logistics, the possibility of theft or damage in transit, and changes to transportation rules.
Mm-hmm.
We also have to think about natural events like extreme weather.
Yeah, those are becoming more frequent and more severe.
And then there's the whole realm of socio-political issues like regional security concerns, corruption, sanctions, and geopolitical disputes.
All of those can have huge impacts on supply chains.
And this is where a strong ERM framework can be incredibly valuable.
Oh, absolutely.
It helps bring everyone together, right? All the different departments that might be affected by supply chain issues.
Yeah, it fosters coordination.
Yeah.
Procurement, manufacturing, logistics, everyone's on the same page.
And it encourages everyone to use the same language and approach when it comes to identifying, evaluating, and measuring those risks.
Mm-hmm. Consistency is key.
And it also promotes that longer-term perspective.
Right.
Making sure that both the urgent risks and the ones that might seem less immediate but are still important are given the attention they deserve.
Exactly. It's about thinking ahead.
Now, that point about nth-party risk was really interesting.
Yeah.
The stats they cited from the COVID period showed that a lot of companies didn't really have a good grasp on the risks faced by their suppliers beyond the first level.
It was eye-opening for a lot of organizations. They realized they didn't know as much as they thought they did.
Yeah, and a big chunk of those COVID-related disruptions actually originated from problems with those tier 2 suppliers and even further down the chain.
That's right. It highlighted just how interconnected and complex these global supply chains really are.
And the material points out that getting full transparency through all those layers of suppliers can be really, really tough.
It's a huge challenge.
But the fact that so many disruptions start in those deeper tiers shows how important it is to try and get as much visibility as possible. Even if you can't see everything perfectly, every bit of information helps.
Yeah, understanding those lower tiers is crucial.
Now, just like we saw with project management, there are standards and frameworks specifically for supply chain risk management.
Mm-hmm.
The material mentions ISO 28000, which focuses on security management, ISO 2400 for sustainable procurement.
Right.
And the very widely used ISO 9001 for quality management, which is often a basic requirement for suppliers.
Those standards provide a good foundation for addressing those specific aspects of risk.
Yeah. And beyond the formal standards, the material also stresses how important risk management is when you're setting up contracts with suppliers.
Oh yeah, contract negotiations are crucial.
Because the type of relationship you have with a supplier, whether it's a close partnership, a joint venture, or straight up outsourcing, each comes with different risks and rewards.
Exactly.
So the terms of the contract need to reflect that.
Right. You need to make sure everyone understands their roles and responsibilities when it comes to managing those risks.
Now, to help companies think strategically about their procurement and their overall approach to the supply chain, the material talks about the Kraljic matrix.
Ah, yes. The Kraljic matrix.
Can you explain how that works and how it relates to managing risk?
Absolutely. It's a really handy tool. It helps you categorize the things you buy based on two things. First, how much that item affects your profitability.
Okay.
And second, how risky it is to get that item.
Right.
So you plot those items on a matrix with profit impact on one axis and supply risk on the other.
Mm-hmm.
And you end up with 4 quadrants. Leverage items, which have a high impact on profit but low supply risk. Strategic items, which are high on both profit impact and risk. Non-critical items, which are low on both. And bottleneck items, which have a low profit impact but high supply risk.
Gotcha.
And each quadrant suggests a different approach to procurement and supply chain management.
Okay. Can you give some examples?
Sure. For leverage items, you've got a lot of negotiating power.
Wait.
For strategic items, you want to build close long-term partnerships and collaborate on managing risks.
Mm.
For non-critical items, you focus on streamlining things to make procurement more efficient.
Okay.
And for bottleneck items, you might need to find alternative suppliers or even support your existing suppliers to make sure you can still get what you need.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
It's interesting that you mentioned bottleneck items. It seems like those might be easy to overlook.
It's a common trap.
Yep.
Organizations might not spend a lot of money on those items, so they don't think the risk is that big.
Right.
But if the supply of a bottleneck item gets disrupted, it can bring everything to a halt.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah.
So as we've looked at these three areas, health and safety, project management, and the supply chain, it's clear that while the specific issues, the jargon, the tools might be different, those core ERM principles apply across the board.
They really do. It's about taking that systematic approach to identifying, assessing, and addressing risks.
Right.
And when you do that, it makes the whole organization more resilient, more capable of achieving its goals, and ultimately more successful in the long run.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up this deep dive today, we want to thank you for sharing this material with us. It's been really insightful.
My pleasure. It's been a great discussion.
And thank you to everyone listening for joining us on this exploration of embedded enterprise risk management. We hope you've learned something valuable today.